Special Operations, Covert Ops, Espionage, The Team House, with your hosts, Jack Murphy and David Park.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 248 of The Team House. I'm Jack Murphy here with Dave Park. Our guest on tonight's show is Michael Vickers. He is the author of By All Means Available. He served in 10th Special Forces Group as a CIA paramilitary officer and then went on to hold positions as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict and the Undersecretary of Defense for Defense Intelligence. We're going to split this interview into two parts since Mike had a pretty extensive career. Tonight, we're going to talk about his time in Special Forces and at the agency. And then we're going to have him back next Friday to discuss the latter portion of his professional career. Mike, thank you for joining us tonight. And Dave, do you want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor?
Yeah, so our sponsor tonight is barbellapparel.com. It's the Cyber Monday sale, runs all next week. Get any jeans, chinos, or pants for $50 off and get up to 50% off everything else. And we love Barbell clothing. I'm wearing their jeans. Their jeans are very stretchy. If I were flexible, you'd see how stretchy they were. Makes my backside look great.
Their workout gear is great too.
The workout gear is fantastic. Yeah, everybody check out Barbell. We love their clothes. It's amazing. I will never buy another pair of jeans, from any place else. They're amazing. Also want to give a quick shout out to Veterans Hockey United. For any veterans, first responders, or family members, if you're into hockey, it's their volunteer leagues that spring up. But check out veteranshockeyunited.com. They're on Instagram. Check them out for all your hockey needs.
So, Mr. Vickers, really appreciate your patience with us and your being gracious with your time. We'll jump right into it here. Could you tell us a little bit about your origin story, sort of about how you grew up and how that took you and led you towards governmental service?
Sure. So I grew up in Southern California and went to Hollywood High School and had dreams of being a professional baseball player or football player or quarterback. And my passions were much greater than my abilities. So as I completed high school, I started thinking about what else I wanted to do. And as it turned out, a high school teacher gave me a copy of the New York Times, or put it in front of my desk when I was in the school library. And it had an article about CIA's big paramilitary operation during the Vietnam War in Laos, supporting the Hmong tribesmen, and said, you might be interested in this. And, it was about secret armies. It's the first I'd heard of it. And I thought, yeah, I think I might want to be a CIA officer. And so that kind of planted the seed. And then I thought the best path for doing that was to go into the Special Forces, which I did after a couple years of college, and then became an officer, and then became a CIA operations officer.
So tell us about landing in 10th Special Forces Group. And I mean, this is during the Cold War, of course. What was 10th Group like at that time? What was your initial roles and duty positions?
Yeah, so I completed the Special Forces qualification course as a weapons sergeant in May 1974, and then was assigned to the 10th Group, which had 2 battalions at Fort Devens, Massachusetts at the time. And, as you know, Special Forces groups are oriented toward different regions of the world. And after Vietnam, the number of groups collapsed down to 3, but the 10th Group had Europe and the Soviet bloc, and basically the operational detachments were divided. Some of them would go, had their operational areas were Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and that's the part I was in, so I had Russian and Czech. And then others had the stay behind mission if the Soviets overran Germany or Scandinavia or others, and so they learned Norwegian and German and French and Danish and that sort of thing. And the group was really a fantastic learning experience. I was kind of the youngest guy on the team. most of my teammates were Vietnam veterans. Some had participated in, very sensitive reconnaissance operations in Laos and North Vietnam with MACV SOG, or studies and observation groups that were doing these dangerous special reconnaissance missions. And then we also had a number of Eastern European emigres, who were born in Czechoslovakia or elsewhere. One of my group commanders was born in Georgia, and another battalion commander was born in Czechoslovakia, and so they were a great source of knowledge about, if we actually had to deploy into our unconventional warfare operational areas, what it would be like to live there and everything else. So it was a tremendous learning experience for me, and they sent me to a lot of training then. In the post-Vietnam era, we didn't have a lot of operations. And so it was mostly a great deal of training till the 1980s. We did have one, our job was mainly to prepare for World War III. And our job was either to do special reconnaissance behind enemy lines or direct action. And then if there was a resistance movement, unconventional warfare. And one special mission we had, a few of us in the group, was to train with very small nuclear weapons, man-portable nuclear weapons, to actually try to stop the Soviet advances, by interdicting the second echelon forces. Had one potential combat deployment to Angola during that period. Angola had gone into a civil war, but it was aborted at the last minute, and the president decided to go the covert action route rather than overt military or special operations uses.
Would you like to talk a little bit about one thing I thought was unique and interesting about your book was you talked about getting sent to Berlin to do like some clandestine tradecraft training?
Yeah, so the 10th group in those days, I mentioned 2 battalions in the group headquarters at Fort Devens. There was a battalion forward at Bad Tolz in Bavaria. I later served in that unit. And then there was essentially a company-sized force in civilian clothes that was in Berlin called Detachment A, changed its name in the 1980s to something else. But they had a stay-behind mission, if the Soviets overran Berlin, and then also potentially to go out into East Germany, given the location of Berlin in the event of war. And so one of the training episodes I had was to go serve with them and do essentially urban unconventional warfare, how we would sabotage facilities and how we would clandestinely communicate so we couldn't be found out by the secret police, and so a lot of denied area tradecrafts.
And then you touched upon it, the training with the special atomic demolition munition.
Yeah.
You tell us a little bit more about what that entailed?
Yeah, so from the early, I guess the late 1960s and early 1970s up until the mid 1980s, special operations forces, mainly SEALs and Green Berets, a select portion of them were given this mission to train, to arm and place this device. And, so with all nuclear weapons, you have personal reliability programs, you have to do extra vetting of the people selected for this, and pretty intensive training. It's really a no-fail mission. So you'd have these operational readiness evaluations by nuclear inspectors to make sure you knew how to do everything. And the command and control for those things, obviously directed from very on high. So there's communications procedures you have to learn. And so it's pretty intensive training. And as I said, the standards were very high for that. And, it was probably considered one of the most risky missions. They were all risky in those days if general war broke out. But this thing in particular, to have to, emplace it, and had a timer on it that, you could arm, and then you'd have to get in an overwatch position to maintain custody of it. So, the kind of the gallows humor among those trained in it was, as soon as you touch that dial, the thing would, if it was in place, it would detonate. And yeah, it was a very interesting experience. And then, learning how to parachute with it, either free fall or static line. And you could also scuba with it too. So that's hence the SEALs or Special Forces scuba teams.
I've actually been doing a lot of research on the green light teams recently, and I think that it's easy for us today to look back on it as this sort of strange Dr. Strangelove sort of esque mission. But what I'm struck by, all the people I talked to, is like how deadly serious all of you guys were about this mission and completely ready to execute it if they were called upon.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so some context, beginning in the 1950s, Soviets had numerical superiority in Europe. And so we kind of went the route in the Eisenhower administration and through the 60s and 70s to make up for that numerical inferiority by having lots of tactical nuclear weapons. So artillery shells, mines, things you can drop from bombs from aircraft. And then this was just part of that family, that this was the Special Forces and SEAL role, to go behind enemy lines with a small nuclear weapon. But, it was part of a larger family. And it was a very, very serious mission.
So as the teenager that read the New York Times article about special ops in Laos, I mean, was this what all of this sounds like a dream come true?
Yeah, I had to pinch myself. I was really lucky. The path actually worked out in terms of, I originally thought I would go into Special Forces for maybe, 5 years or something, and then go to CIA. And I decided to become an officer and ended up staying for 10 before I went to CIA. So I really loved it. It was just a great experience.
So you went to officer candidate school, and then you got to do a pretty big venue change from Germany in 10th Group to 3rd Battalion, 7th Group that was down at Fort Gulick, Panama, right?
That's right. Yeah, I was on the Atlantic side of the Canal Zone rather than the Pacific side. So most of the forces in Panama were over on the Pacific side, but there was an infantry battalion and a Special Forces battalion on the Atlantic. And the reason I chose that, when I graduated from OCS, we didn't have an SF branch in those days. And so I was an infantry officer, went to infantry officer training. And the assignments officer came down to our class as we were getting our assignments and said, how would you like to go right back to Special Forces and be a detachment commander? Because you don't need to be a platoon leader given your enlisted experience. You could go right into company command. And I thought, well, great. So I get a captain's job as a lieutenant, and then a captain's job as a captain. And, there were 3 assignments offered: the 10th Group, the 5th Group, and 3rd of the 7th. And I was very tempted to go back to the 10th Group. My former battalion commander had become the group commander, and he just got the Medal of Honor award in Paris Davis this year. And but the insurgencies were really heating up in Central America. That was the big focus. We had a communist insurgency in El Salvador, and then the Sandinistas had taken over in Nicaragua. And it's always good to kind of follow the sound of guns, to go where the action is. And so I learned Spanish and ended up in 3rd Battalion, 7th Group. And as it turned out, I was after the Iran rescue attempt and the taking of our, I should say it the other way, the taking of our hostages in Tehran, and then the Iran rescue attempt, we became very concerned about other high threat embassies. And so I was given essentially a troop command of 2 operational detachments that would go around to high threat embassies in Latin America, mainly Central America, but Colombia and others too, to make sure that if we needed to do a rescue, our special mission forces, that they had the blueprints and knew where the cameras were, and all the things you would need to do a rescue like that. So it caused me to interact a lot with the State Department and with CIA, across the region, and again, a great learning experience.
I thought it was really cool as I was reading the book. I think you said it was the AST mission and then became the RST mission.
Yes.
This is that sort of nascent, what we would call today, advanced force operations is probably the term that you probably use nowadays. As I was reading the book, I read about this operation that you guys got sent down to Honduras, and I was like, oh, I remember hearing about this years and years ago, but I had no idea it was you. Could you explain a little bit more about like what the mission entailed and how you guys went over to sort of prepare the environment?
Sure. So, the normal mission was, intelligence collection. So, visiting these embassies and making sure we had all the information we would need for a rescue beforehand. And then if there was an actual terrorist incident, then a small portion of my team would deploy to be the first on site, where we'd been to this country several times, and start preparing the environment for the rescue force that would come in, but also provide special operations advice to the ambassador and the country team, chief of station, ambassador, etc. And so in late April 1982, a Honduran terrorist group supported by Cuba hijacked an airliner, a -7 airliner, a prop plane in Tegucigalpa Airport, the capital of Honduras, with 58 hostages on board, and 10 of whom were Americans. And so we got deployed right away by Southcom to the embassy to meet with the ambassador, who I served with a lot of years in government. He ended up becoming ambassador multiple places, John Negroponte, and then Deputy Secretary of State, and about military options, including bringing in, some of our special mission forces to be in a position to do a rescue. And so they came in, and there was a 3-day standoff with this a terrorist group with the hostages. I was up for 3 nights, essentially, with my little team, my 4-man team, doing surveillance around the airfield, and with our Army Special Operations counterparts. And we had one interesting incident. The terrorists had a homemade improvised explosive device with nitroglycerin on the plane. And, the airplane was getting really hot, and nitroglycerin can become unstable when it gets hot like that. So the terrorists actually asked for assistance in that regard, and we had to scramble to how they would defuse the bomb. And it turned out, kitty litter was a pretty good field expedient to do. So we raced out to Tegucigalpa to procure some, and that kind of did the trick. And some of the hostages were able to escape from the plane on the 3rd day, and there were gunfire, but fortunately they were only injured from the fall, not from the terrorist shots. And then the terrorists decided to give up the ghost after 3 days for safe passage to Cuba. And so that was incident number 1. And then 4 months later, a similar terrorist group took 109 hostages in San Pedro Sula, a town in the north of Honduras, including 3 government ministers. So we did it all over again and went there and did a 10-day siege, and it ended the same way with negotiations.
And also showed the capabilities of that the concept worked as far as the reconnaissance.
Yes. So it was considered a model for other combatant commands to then follow Southcom's lead on having this kind of capability, and that eventually led to more special operations intelligence units, and then the RSTs, as you mentioned.
When you guys were developing this capability, if you're developing a capability, there's not necessarily groundwork that's been laid before. How did you guys go about that process?
Yeah, so it was a, kind of a one of a kind unit at the time, made out of 2 ODAs, and people were selected for their fluency and, civilian clothes and long hair, um, selected for their fluency in Spanish and their intelligence tradecraft, in addition to other special operations skills, and uh, and then had to have training. We were kind of ahead of our time on satellite communications. So we had really reliable communications, um, some technical surveillance devices and stuff that weren't organic to the Special Forces Battalion, that we had to procure commercially and learn how to use. And so we were really building this from the ground up, including, learning how to put these target folders together of what exactly was needed and how to present it to the operators, who would do the rescue. And so you needed to know a lot about close quarter battle and sniping and lots of other things. So right before I had that command for a few months, I had command of a sniper team, which also was useful, personal preparation before I took this counterterrorism intelligence mission.
And then let's talk a little bit about how you made that transition from special forces to the CIA. Like, how did that take place for you?
So my original goal was to serve in the special forces and learn more languages and get competent in all these disciplines, and then go to CIA. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll make the Army a career. And, I went to OCS and had this command. But as I was wrestling with it, I thought, okay, I've had this great experience as a lieutenant and captain commanding this troop and participating in real operations, but my next assignment would be infantry company command in a peacetime army. And I thought I wanted to join more of the Cold War fight. I saw what was going on in Central America and what CIA was doing. And I thought potentially I could contribute more if I went to CIA. And so I applied for the career training program and, got accepted and joined the agency.
And the way I read it in the book, if I understood correctly, you had some adventures before you even got trained as a CIA officer.
Yeah. So in my day, the career training program for operations officers, we had a 10-week course, kind of introduction to CIA and the intelligence community, all the different directorates, and learned how to write reports and do analysis and some basic tradecraft, and learned about our satellites and, the science and technology side, and et cetera. Had senior case officers come in and talk to us about agents they recruited, and including Russians that were handled in Moscow. And, so it was pretty good training. And then you'd typically do 2-3 month assignments on a operational desk to learn operations more. And then you would go to the operations course at what we call the farm, a special facility. And then in those days, we also had a 12-week paramilitary operations course called special operations training. And during my first assignment in Latin America division, I was selected for this because there was a coup in Suriname, and a former Dutch colony in northern tip of South America. And we had assets in prison, and the branch chief wanted to do a jailbreak, essentially, and thought I had the right skills to help plan that with assets and stuff. And so that was kind of my introduction to CIA. And then lo and behold, a crisis occurred in Grenada as I was some weeks into this assignment, working on this jailbreak plan. And, we had 600 medical students attending training in Grenada, American medical students. And, the situation deteriorated. The coup leaders killed the president of the country and some others. And President Reagan made the decision over a weekend to do the invasion of Grenada. It was a combination of Special Operations Forces and Marines. And before I had even completed my CIA operational training, I was called into headquarters and said by who was going to become the chief of station, a man named Bill Rooney, very distinguished career in CIA, said, "You're going to Grenada with me and a communicator." And we were going in with the Special Operations Forces in the main effort in the South. And I didn't know that at the time. I was just told to come into headquarters and pack for 2 weeks on a Sunday. And so I thought I was going to be going to one of the bases supporting the operations. And so I packed a bunch of suits. And as soon as I got in and I was told I was going into combat, I was glad I had a few casual clothes in my luggage, and so we got weapons, we got a lot of cash so we could pay assets and stuff. And the SATCOM radio got a briefing and had an airplane take us to a staging base, and then went in with the invading forces. And so I went into combat with a Ralph Lauren polo shirt, some linen pants, and some loafers, and a weapon, and a big bag of cash, and a SATCOM. You got to hand it to CIA. They go to war in style. This is not quite how we did it in the Special Forces. But,
and the military element you're linking up probably looks, you go, CIA. They don't know anything.
Right, yeah. And so, our task was to establish a station and then, bring in people to interrogate Cuban prisoners and others. And then, we had some other things to do that led to my first combat experience in Grenada, looking at an arms cache in the very, very forward lines where there was still a lot of combat. And it was a company of the 82nd that we were actually visiting at the time. And, lo and behold, as soon as we got there, Cubans attacked the position. And, all we had at the time were Browning high-power pistols. And so I thought about it as we're face down in the dirt, I thought about it for a few seconds, and I thought, I just saw a bunch of AKs and ammunition in this warehouse, that were Cubans for the Grenadans. And I thought, we could use some of those if we're going to get shot at and shoot back. So low crawled over there, got some, gave one to my chief of station and one for me, and battle was over in 10 minutes. But it was an interesting experience.
And so I think you said you spent like a week crawling around Grenada, and then showed up back home, covered in dirt in your Ralph Lauren polo shirt that you'd been wearing for a week.
Yeah, so it was actually almost 2 weeks. And we had another mission where we were told to apprehend a Libyan intelligence officer on the island who had been ordered by Gaddafi to take American hostages. And before we could capture him, he had fled to the Soviet embassy, but we had this chase around St. George's, the capital. And toward the end of the operation, that when the training staff learned that I had been in combat for 10 days, they weren't too happy about it. And so they said, "Okay, war's over for you, come home." And so I hitched a military flight to Barbados, took off, went into the bathroom, took off all my dirty clothes, threw them in the trash can, put on some fresh civilian clothes, took my Amex card out, bought a plane ticket, for the States, and came home.
I'm really surprised you didn't get like a deal with Ralph Lauren after that, and like they didn't develop a new combat line of leisure wear.
Yeah, there you go.
So now you finally have the opportunity to go to the farm and become, a formalized officer.
Yeah. So before that, when I came into the agency, I had Czech, Russian, and Spanish, and I was debating whether I would go to Latin America where the wars were, or, to Moscow or somewhere for a first assignment. And so I thought I would get assigned to Soviet operations when I came back from Grenada. That's what I had requested. And they called me in. As it turned out, we invaded Grenada on a Tuesday. The Sunday before, the Marine barracks were blown up in Lebanon. And then months before that, our embassy had been blown up by, what today we know as Hezbollah. And so I was called in and said, the Near East Division wants you assigned to them for a special counterterrorism task force to identify the perpetrators and develop response options, et cetera. And I said, I don't know anything about the Middle East, and well, it's a directed assignment and they want you. And so that was my introduction to the Middle East, to work with our station there on assets who could report on Hezbollah and then develop various strike options. And then after that, I went to the farm.
Just to wrap up Beirut, was there any kind of final thoughts, or did anything come out of that time that you spent there that you thought was notable or important, or even personal reflections?
Yeah. So, one, Grenada was this great, exhilarating experience, and it felt like a real extension of what I'd been doing in special forces, particularly the last years as an officer in Latin America. And, I knew the people we were going in with, and so it was like old home week for me. And the operation, there were problems, but the operation was generally a success. With Lebanon, we had a peacekeeping force in there with the Marines who did not have good rules of engagement, very restrictive rules of engagement. And, it was really kind of muddled policy for a country that was, essentially heading into civil war and sectarian conflict. And the same thing, our station had similar challenges, and so Americans started getting kidnapped, including our chief of station, the late Bill Buckley, tortured and killed. And so it really was a searing experience for me in terms of, failed policy of, we weren't in it to win it, and we essentially put ourselves in a position where we were very vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And as I said, it was my introduction into the Middle East, and then later, decades later, when I was involved in Iraq and others, seeing that sectarian conflict again, it brought back all those memories.
Yeah. When you did go to the farm, now you're going to the farm, but you've already had combat experience as a CIA officer or a CIA employee. Did that help you or hurt you, or did nobody there know about it?
Yeah, they knew about it, and it was both. The chief instructor pulled me aside. I got an award for heroism, and one of the top agency officials came down and they talked about it. And some of the instructors were, okay, let's test this guy's mettle some more, so he doesn't think he's too big for his britches and all that. But others, were impressed. And one guy said to me, geez, you really just, picked up the weapons and did this. I don't know if I could have done that in that situation. And this guy had served in mostly Europe. And I thought, well, this is kind of what I'd been trained to do for 10 years. So it's kind of nature. But so it was a mixture actually of both, some let's screw with them a little bit. And then others, I was in a little bit of a special class.
But some of them were sort of like, okay, you can handle Grenada, but let's see how you handle the seedier sides of Virginia.
Sure.
Right. Can you man up?
Yeah. Right.
And after the farm, you got what as I recall, you describe in your book as sort of your dream assignment. You got assigned to Ground Branch.
Yeah. So, after the operations course where you're trained to recruit and handle agents, then we had this special operations course, including another airborne school, 5 parachute jumps, which was old hat. But, and it was sort of like a special forces qualification course, again, not as strenuous, but same basic tactics and techniques. And then as I came out again and was thinking about where I would go for an assignment, which division or part of the world, Soviet, East European, or Latin America, what today is the Special Activities Center, then it was called International Activities because it had counterterrorism and counter-narcotics as well as the paramilitary stuff. The division chief there said to me, we would like you to come to this division because we're creating a program to fast track a few officers for leadership of our covert action that would combine case officer work with management of these covert action programs, and said, we want you to be the first case. And so, well, how you can argue with a senior official and, on a fast track to the top. So I did. And then he said, where do you want to go? You want to go to El Salvador? What would you like for a first tour? And I thought, well, there's a lot of wars going on. And so if you don't mind, I'd like to go to ground branch first and then do the case officer stuff next. And said, sure. So I got assigned to ground branch in special operations group. And then within a couple weeks, I was told that they were creating this new position for the Afghanistan covert action program, combining two jobs into one, essentially. The program officer overall oversight of management of the program, which had been a senior CIA case officer, and then the chief paramilitary advisor, who had been a Marine colonel on detail, and they were combining them into two, and interviewed a bunch of candidates and thought I was the right guy for the job. So it was really like the job of a lifetime for me, and I thought, instead of just fighting Soviet surrogates in Central America or elsewhere, now we've got the main enemy in Afghanistan, right. And so it really seemed like the job of a lifetime.
Prior to that, though, you going to or volunteering to go to ground branch, like you said, was that did some people consider that like a misstep in a career, as it wasn't really attached to a larger division or whatever, and like, did it have legitimacy in the wider agency at the time?
Yes and no. I mean, there were a lot of paramilitary operations going on that hadn't been before, Central America and Afghanistan. And so that raised the important, they were the first ones since Laos in a big way. But yeah, in those days, ground branch officers didn't become chiefs of station. Later they would, integrated more into the directorate of operations. And so that's why I kind of chose the general operations track.
Right.
I knew I could do the paramilitary stuff, but I didn't want to just do that,
right.
Since I had aspirations to become a chief of station and other things. And so, and my reasoning was just, this is a unique time. We're in a lot of wars and I have skills that can contribute to this. And so I want to do this first, but I knew I'd have to do the other stuff.
Right.
So as you get on the Afghan program, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, I mean, you dedicated your book to Gust and Bert Dunn. And I'd love to ask you about those two gentlemen, and if you could tell us about coming onto the program and working with them.
Sure. So the Near East and South Asia Division was responsible for agency operations from Morocco to Bangladesh, and essentially divided in half. The Arab-Israeli world up to the Arabian Gulf, the Gulf states and Iraq, and then Iran over to Bangladesh for South Asian operations. And Gustav Rakatos, a veteran case officer and Greek American, was the chief of South Asian operations. And so he's the guy who wanted to create this new position as program officer and chief paramilitary advisor into one, and brought me in. And then Bert Dunn was his boss. Bert Dunn had just come in as the chief of Near East Division. And Bert was one of the founding members of Special Forces, a West Virginia lawyer, founding members of Special Forces in 1952, and had been in the 82nd before that, in his Army time, and then joined the CIA after law school. And his first assignment was in Pakistan and learned Pashto. He was the agency's most fluent Pashto speaker, and set up the Pakistani Special Forces and went all over, the tribal areas. In those days, we had the U-2 flights over the Soviet Union out of Peshawar. Gary Powers and all that. And so I was involved in that too. And he'd served in all these difficult places around the world. He'd been chief in Afghanistan. He'd served in Pakistan, India, supporting Tibetan insurgents when we were doing that in the 60s against China. Served in Vietnam, and then in Africa. And so he was my kind of, both of them were really my kind of guys, street smart, but also, a guy who went to the sound of guns and had the special forces background. And so we just clicked, and they were very good to me.
And as the program, I mean, I'd love to hear in your words how this program evolved as it sort of got off the ground. And there was a presidential finding for Afghanistan. And the impression I get reading through your book is that as time went on, the spigot became fully open. Like we were really about sticking it to the Soviets in Afghanistan.
Yeah. So, as background, there was kind of this great game, first between the Russians and the British, and then the 19th century, and then later in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union for influence in Afghanistan. And the Soviets generally got the better of the deal. They built a tunnel, they trained a lot of Afghan military officers, and then they started underground communist parties in the 60s. And we focused on agriculture in the South, in Helmand province, and up to that period. And then in 1973, the king's cousin overthrew him after several decades of royal rule, and the prime minister ran the country for 5 years, and then he was overthrown in 1978 by the communist parties with Soviet support. Launching a communist revolution in Afghanistan, and immediately it triggered resistance. Trying to impose land reform, which really means land appropriation, and then atheism. Just not going to fly in Afghanistan. And the communist Afghan government asked for Soviet assistance, and Soviets were given a lot, but didn't want to intervene, until they did finally. And so before the Soviets intervened in December, late December 1979, that summer, there were a couple of what we call non-lethal findings to provide political and psychological support to the resistance, and money, essentially, and communications support. And then when the Soviets invaded in force, then 3 days after that, President Jimmy Carter signed a lethal finding authorizing CIA, the third finding, authorizing CIA to support the resistance, fully with, and so within 10 days, CIA actually had weapons starting flowing to the resistance. But for the first 5 years, President Carter's last year and President Reagan's first term, the program was reasonably big. It was, we had a lot of foreign partners, and the Saudis being one, obviously Pakistan. The Saudis matched us dollar for dollar. And so the US government budget was $60 million, and the Saudis matched that. So it was $120 million a year. But analysts thought there was no chance that the resistance could defeat the Soviets. The policy goal in the finding was just to make the occupation as costly as possible for the Soviets. So the war kind of settled into this stalemate, and the resistance was lightly equipped, mostly with small arms, not a lot of heavy weapons, mortars and anti-tank weapons and rocket launchers and stuff. Very few surface-to-air missiles, a handful of them, 20 or so. Not a lot of training, communications, not a lot of intelligence, but they were still holding their own against the Soviets. And then in the summer of 1984, Congressman Charlie Wilson from Texas, who was on the House Defense Appropriation Subcommittee, really wanted to expand the funding for the program. So CIA went in for a 10% budget increase, and Wilson quadrupled the budget, 300% increase, which you don't see every day. And so that's right at the, and so that naturally caused a lot of concern in CIA about, can we execute this? Is it too much money? Can the resistance absorb it? And that's exactly the moment that I got the job. And I thought, hell yeah, we can execute this. Just a month or two,
18 Bravo, of course you think you can execute on it.
Right, exactly. Here's what I'm going to do with this, and so
P for plenty.
Yeah, developing plans and everything else. And so a series of things led to a big change. That was the first one that, the funding just went way up, and the Saudis agreed to match it. And then 5 years into the war, we were getting some criticism in Congress, and Central America was already very controversial.
Mm-hmm.
You had a thing called the Boland Amendment that suspended aid to the Contras for a while and other things. But the controversy on Afghanistan was, some Republicans felt that the Pakistanis were a corruption problem. The Pakistanis were keeping all the weapons for themselves, and they weren't getting into the resistance. And so we had to show that, and that CIA's management of the program wasn't very good, because we were letting the Pakistanis control the end distribution. And so we had to address that. And then on the left side of the aisle, there was concern that this was a hopeless war and we're just fighting to the last Afghan, and it was immoral. And so that triggered a National Security Council review of the program, how to deal with these political problems, from both left and right. But as any good NSC review, it also said, okay, what are we trying to do here? We're 5 years into this thing. Should we revisit our goals? And what today we would call a paper principles committee meeting, the NSC staff circulated documents with questions that the State Department, Defense Department, and CIA were supposed to answer about, our goals and what we thought we should do. And one of them was, instead of, stay the course, et cetera, it was to change our goal to defeating the Soviets and drive them out by all means available. It was in the working papers. And I liked the phrase. I remembered it 30 years later and, made it the title of my book. But I thought, that's the one we want to do, with all this new money. And, didn't really have an idea yet totally how we would do that. But reprogrammed everything I could in terms of more heavy weapons, more this, more that. But I knew it wasn't going to be enough yet. And lo and behold, George Shultz at the State Department and his key deputies went along with this. CIA's leadership did under Bill Casey, Caspar Weinberger in Defense did, on the policy side. And so our goal then became to defeat the Soviets and drive them out. And President Reagan signed a top secret national security decision directive, which has been mostly declassified for the past decade, with that goal in mind. That was our aim there. And so in a sense, now we had a hunting license to do what was required to do that. And so then that triggered, okay, can we get all our partners to escalate with us? And so that meant wresting strategic control. So we controlled the strategy from the Pakistanis, and that would help solve this issue of, are they controlling too much or diverting things? But also for us to put in all these new weapons and both quantity and quality. And then getting our suppliers, the Chinese were a big ally of ours and our largest arms supplier, and Egypt was another. Would they agree with the escalation? And not only escalation in quantity, but also in more advanced weapons, rocket launchers from the Chinese, surface-to-air missiles, that would really make our partners more vulnerable. And, Pakistan, in terms of subversion and maybe invasion, the Chinese with diplomatic repercussions when their weapons are found, surface-to-air missiles are shooting down Soviet aircraft. And so I had to go to all these countries with the top leadership of their intelligence services to try to get them to go along with the escalation, and they all did within 6 months. And then that included trying to get a more advanced surface-to-air weapon. In covert action programs, you want plausible deniability. So what covert means for your listeners is you're concealing the sponsor of the operation, but not the operation, because you're influencing events. You're supporting a war, you're doing political action or whatever it is, but you don't want the United States role to be apparent. Even if people suspect it, you're not acknowledging it.
Right.
And so in paramilitary operations, the ones that are kind of the most deniable are when you're using the enemy's weapons, which is what the Afghan program was for the first 5 years. And then, you can lift up the skirt a little more by going to Western weapons, and then even more with US weapons. And within 12 months, we kind of went to the spectrum in certain high areas. We went for Western surface-to-air missiles, a British blowpipe, and then eventually the US Stinger. So further escalations in that regard. So first the Brits turned us down on the blowpipe, and then we went back to them, and Prime Minister Thatcher agreed. And so we started that program up. And then we went back to Congress and said, we now have a strategy and a real detailed plan. And we know you quadrupled our budget, but we actually need double that. If you'll just double it one more time and take us up to $1 billion, we think we can actually achieve this objective in a couple of years. And lo and behold, Charlie Wilson came through again that summer and transferred money from the Department of Defense, and the Saudis matched it. And so within less than 12 months, the program had increased by a factor of more than 10, from like 120 million to almost 1.2 billion, where it leveled off. And then lots of, we went from 20 surface-to-air missiles, some of which didn't work, to, damn near 2,000, and increased our training by a factor of 10, and, all sorts of other things. And so the tempo of combat went up, the number of aircraft shot down, the size of ambushes, the attacks on urban areas and bases, shelling with rockets, shelling into Kabul, all that just increased dramatically. And at the same time, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union in March '85, just as we were beginning on this escalation path, all of '85. Took his top general from Eastern Europe, East Germany, and put him in charge. Said, got 2 years to win the war. We'll give you 25,000 more troops to the 105 that the Soviets had there already. So we had this dual escalation, ours covert and theirs overt. And within 12 months, we had won that battle of the surges, and Gorbachev started looking for the exit.
Mike, when just out of curiosity, when you're going around and selling, partner nations on the idea of increasing their investments, increasing the weapons shipped to Afghanistan, things like that, do you need a different pitch for each country? Because Afghanistan isn't necessarily strategically necessary for anybody. Is it just the idea of bleeding the Soviet Union?
Yeah, so it differed in each case. So, with China, they had a border clash in 1969, and we had, the opening to China led by Henry Kissinger and Nixon, and then consolidated in the normalization of relations under President Carter, and started an intelligence partnership with the Chinese, and then started supporting the Afghan program because they wanted to weaken the Soviets and have them tied down in a war because, they were worried about a Soviet invasion of China from the north. Soviet priorities were NATO #1, that was the big war, China #2, and then maybe Iran #3, and Afghanistan was kind of #4 there, which is why we thought there were limits on their ability to escalate. And so with the Chinese, it was really more a case of they're already in it. Are they willing to go in it even more with more sophisticated weapons and numbers of weapons? And, there was a debate about whether they would. The national intelligence officer for China told me there's no way they will give you these surface-to-air missiles, and they ended up doing it, and where with Pakistan, it was a function of the Islamic world not liking these infidels invading a Muslim country. And so that, affected Egypt and Pakistan. And then with Pakistan, there was the risk of, cross-border raids with Soviet special forces, airstrikes, sabotage by the KGB and Afghan Secret Service, and maybe an invasion, because the Soviets would do these big sweeps, search and destroy missions right up to the border. And so it's a little different for them. And they were in it, but it took some convincing more about the risk of, escalation that would directly affect them as the frontline state. I should have mentioned Saudi Arabia too, another one that, was mostly helping fund the program. But again, it was the invasion of a Muslim country. And then with the Brits, it was more high technology. We were partnering on intelligence collection and other things and support for resistance commanders. But it was really, do we want to stick it to the Soviets with this advanced weapon that they're not going to like, that shoots down more aircraft? And same for the U.S. decision. So, the pitch was tailored to their own interests in Afghanistan in each case.
I think you answered at least half of my next question, but because you talked about it in the book at some length, I wanted to ask you about the covert operation cooperation that you mentioned with China, which is this interesting historical interlude, almost impossible to imagine something like that happening today. But I just wanted to see if I can tease out of you a little bit any sort of cultural observations about their approach to warfare, covert operations, or anything else that you took away from those numerous meetings where you interfaced directly with the Chinese intelligence apparatus.
Yeah, so, it was very interesting in a sense that, they had the long Chinese Civil War, and, Mao had been dead for almost a decade, and Deng Xiaoping actually approved this big escalation. But, so in our initial discussions, we had big debates about guerrilla warfare strategy. And, so try different visions about how to defeat the Soviets in Afghanistan. Is it really lots of people armed with AKs, or is it combined arms and stuff, which I was pushing, and more, shift the anti-air balance more in the insurgents' favor and stuff. And so that took some convincing. We went back and forth, and they're saying to me, look, we really know guerrilla warfare. We overthrew our own government this way. And I'd say, well, yeah, I know something about it too, and here's why I think we need to do this. And they finally went along, but it was very interesting. It was very interesting culturally, in a sense that their negotiating style, you weren't allowed to, when you made presentations, they would just say, continue with no break, and if you said, you couldn't ask them questions when they were talking for 30 minutes and they didn't want any interruption. If I'd say, well, okay, you want me to elaborate on this or something, then just continue, and so we were really almost like ships passing in the night. And then, as I later learned, they do with businesses a lot, you don't clinch the deal until the very end. And so it looked like we weren't going to get everything we want. We were heading to we got some things. We were heading to the airport, and they're waiting for us in an airport lounge with drinks and stuff, was the head of armaments for the PLA, and saying, okay, read everything. And I thought, all right, better late than never. But yeah, it was, and I imagined myself when I was in special forces, in the 10th group, where we had this World War III mission, and to liberate Eastern Europe. I thought this would be, if this ever came to pass, this would be, T.E. Lawrence and all this great stuff. But I also thought I'd read, about World War II and OSS in China and others, and I knew about the border conflict that they had in '69. I'd studied that as I was completing my bachelor's degree. And I thought, well, maybe I'd find myself on the side of the Chinese against the Russians. That would be really exotic. Eastern Europe, I kind of know, but this one would be exotic. And lo and behold, they became my partner to fight in Afghanistan. I didn't have the imagination to think about that, but
Yeah.
As far as the end game in Afghanistan, I mean, the obvious end of the conflict is the Soviet withdrawal. When did you know it was over?
Really in sort of early 1986. Gorbachev gave this open speech in February '86 about bleeding wound, and we've got to extricate ourselves from this. And our escalation was just starting. I mean, we had flows of stuff going there through 1987. And this meant strengthening the logistics system, from ships to what you do at ports, to railroads, to trucks, to warehouses, and then to Toyota Land Cruisers, and even, 10,000 mules. I grew up in Hollywood. I didn't know a damn thing about mules. And suddenly I find myself dealing with China about, 10,000 of these things. And it turns out Chinese mules were better for Afghanistan than Tennessee mules, which, who would think? But there's in the mountains. And so it really was pretty clear in '86. But then you had this dance of negotiations. The first Soviet 6 regiments come out that summer, but the Soviets are hoping that we'll leave the Afghan government in place. And so there's negotiations about that. And the U.S. rightly holds firm. And then eventually Gorbachev says, okay, we just want out. We don't care what kind of government is there. And that cinched the deal. And then from the time the agreement was signed, they withdrew in 2 big phases. And so that was not quite a year, like 9 months, but so it just played out in slow motion. But the writing was on the wall. Their tactics shifted. Once we started shooting down so many aircraft, they started flying above surface-to-air missile range, which meant they couldn't do close air support very well. They didn't do offensive operations as much anymore. They just kind of hunkered down to their bases, and so it was pretty clear. And also, they announced this policy, like we did in Vietnam, the Afghanization, to basically shift to an indirect role where the communist Afghans are going to do the fighting, and the Soviets are going to support them, but not do the combat. And so we saw all that, and that kind of, led to the end game. What was important was holding their feet to the fire, really sustaining this through this period. And this is where I really I think there's important lessons from President Reagan in this, is that, as relations were really warming between Reagan and Gorbachev, and, big breakthroughs in diplomacy, we kept the heat on in Afghanistan, pressure, and still said, look, we want to do business with you. This can be great, but, we disagree on this one thing. And, he ended up getting his way.
Yeah.
As we kind of get towards the end of part 1 of our interview with you, I wanted to ask a couple questions that are sort of like big picture, things that I think maybe you're uniquely qualified to answer. At the time, we've talked at length about supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. At the same time, there were paramilitary programs supporting UNITA in Angola and the FDN, or the Contras, in Nicaragua. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about these 3 essentially anti-Soviet covert operations around the world, and what was the global strategy behind them?
Yeah, and there was also a brief period of supporting Cambodians against the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia, although it was very, very small. So, it really, we started this period on defense in Central America. Nicaragua had fallen to the Sandinistas, and there was a sense that the Soviets and their Cuban allies and others were really on the march. And insurgency really exploded in El Salvador. And, so we were counterinsurgency and essentially dealing there. And then the Contra program is kind of the first big one in a sense, because Afghanistan is this, we're doing what we can there, but there's no thought you're going to win, where we really didn't want to lose. And we certainly didn't want to have more countries fall to communism in Central America, but there was even a hope, well, maybe we could defeat them in Nicaragua and at least in our backyard, so it starts off fairly modest. And then as you move to 1984, the Contra program becomes politically controversial and has this hiatus, and it's doing so. We had a lot of success in counterinsurgency in El Salvador, but not as much, on the offensive side in Nicaragua. And then as Afghanistan escalates, that then becomes the real main effort. And so people's minds change between this is hopeless to maybe we can win there, and if we win here, it really matters. This is the main enemy in the big enchilada, where if you win in Nicaragua, you move a pawn on the chessboard rather than a queen. And then Angola picks up, I think, in 86 or so, and the Cubans had sent a big proxy army into Angola, 20-some thousand troops, and that kicks in as well. And then President Reagan gives the Reagan Doctrine speech, which is we'll support anti-communist insurgencies. And I want to say that's early 85, if I remember right. And it provides kind of the strategic framework for this global irregular war that kind of came in parts, essentially, and at different times and different emphasis. And it's tied to a broader strategy of restricting technology transfer, hurting the Soviets with low oil prices, other things to kind of weaken the system. And then, of course, the Reagan buildup, that they really can't match this defense.
Star Wars.
Yeah, and that, missile defense. And then since the late 70s, we started shifting our strategy, our conventional strategy in Europe to deep attack. We knew we really couldn't, up until, say, 1976, our strategy was to trade space for time, essentially to withdraw under pressure of a Soviet advance. And every war game showed that they could break through on multiple fronts, and it just didn't work. Once we developed the precision weapons and the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance and other things, the first stealth aircraft, the F-117, the Army tactical missile system, that's finally getting to Ukraine today, the joint surveillance and target acquisition, JSTARS, that really worried the Soviets about their strategy, that, all the second echelon forces would be vulnerable. And, rather than having a tank battle right up at front, those reinforcing forces could get hit. And that's why the Soviet General Staff backed Gorbachev, because as they looked out, 10, 20 years, they thought, we're just going to fall further behind the United States in technology, and we got to do something to revitalize our system to catch up. And so all that weighed them down.
Do you think that all of these...
And then I would add, too, support for solidarity in Poland. That was a big one, too, keeping them alive.
Yep.
Do you think that all these counter sort of Soviet wars that we fought that, are challenging because you can't always mold the indigenous peoples that you are your proxy soldiers, right? They're doing their thing. But do you think that all those led up to Gorbachev, to the, because in '89 we saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, like that? Do you think that we basically defeated the Soviet Union through these, even if we didn't win in the specific places all the time?
Yeah, so I think, in Nicaragua, the result was a little more ambiguous because the Sandinistas got defeated in an election in 1990, but pressure from the insurgents. In Angola, we really defeated the Cubans, and in Afghanistan defeated the Soviets, and it was the only defeat the Red Army had suffered in its history. So, real blow to its credibility and claim on resources, and same with the KGB. And I do think that had a big effect on the Soviets. It's not the only thing that led to the dissolution of the Soviet Empire. Gorbachev's critical in that, in a sense, not using force in Eastern Europe when the wall starts crumbling down and Solidarity gets elected, and all that. But the defeat of the Red Army was a big deal.
Another sort of like big picture, and this is more of a institutional question, and I hope I won't start a food fight with this one, but the differences between the Special Activities Division and Special Forces, or between Ground Branch and Special Forces, what are the pros and cons of each? Why do we maintain these two, in some ways, parallel capabilities?
Yeah, so that's a question that's been debated over the decades. Should CIA just focus on intelligence and not covert action, and particularly paramilitary covert action, where the military has very strong capabilities? And so, part of the reason for that is the political benefits of covert action to begin with. So the way I like to describe it, if we're going to support an insurgency against the hostile power in peacetime, presidents overwhelmingly defer to CIA there. So it's not a question of capabilities. It's a question of plausible deniability and escalation control. And, if we had special forces doing Afghanistan, it's not that they couldn't do it technically. It's that you run a higher risk that you're going to trigger a direct war than if CIA is doing it. You're still killing Soviets. It's still a war. It's just that it provides this level of control that president seems to go to. And then when you go to war, particularly a big war, you don't have enough CIA for that. And then there's no reason not to use your military, for that. And then all these other missions, counterterrorism, and, that require real surgical skill and everything, that's properly the military, and those things occur in peacetime. But, so there's this kind of division of labor based on, the politics of it, and whether covert or overt makes sense, or whether, and then CIA essentially working through partners with a smaller footprint, rather than something more muscular. As you get to the more muscular side, you get to DoD, and that's true in a number of areas, whether it's drones or whether it's cyber. You have capabilities in both areas, but for different purposes. And so I think it serves the country. It gives the president more options, and it serves the country well to have both. But you got to know the limitations of both.
There's sort of this idea or rumor, I guess, that Republican presidents will lean more heavily on the military and Democratic presidents will lean more heavily on the CIA. Do you think that's an actual thing, or is it just sort of whomever fits best?
Yeah, I don't think that bears out necessarily in history. I mean, from the last 2 decades of the Cold War and maybe parts of the last 20 years, the differences in general about aggressive foreign policy have differentiated the parties until recently, when you've got all this isolationism strain creeping in. But, part of the reason I think analysts explain that Republicans won 5 out of 6 presidential elections in the late Cold War is because they were trusted more on national security. So I think rather than military or CIA, I think it's more how aggressively you use either one. There's still nuances in both, like I said. what Carter started, Reagan continued, and then Reagan escalated, but it took a while.
Right.
And then, after 9/11, President Bush, for the invasion of Afghanistan, went with essentially a CIA-led plan because it was very rapid. And, of course, the military was going to fold in on that. CIA wasn't going to fight the Afghan war by themselves, but
Right.
you needed air power and you needed special forces and all that. But the initial options that the military came up with weren't unconventional. They were airstrikes or massive invasion, and President Bush didn't want to. Airstrikes were too little and massive invasion too late. So that's what kind of drove it.
Do we have any questions?
And then the other thing that drives it is our foreign partners. A lot of times for their own risk, they'll want to deal with CIA or intelligence channels because they think it provides them more protection. And and then it's also flexible. Like we can, if CIA needs certain capabilities that the Department of Defense has, we can loan them to them.
Right.
So and so then it's just a question of what authority do you want.
Right.
I think we have a few viewer questions.
Yeah,
for
we have
you,
some.
Mike.
We have some great questions. First off, Rory, thank you very much for the donation. I didn't see a question. If there is one, please throw it in chat, and we'll keep an eye out for it. Andrew Dunbar, thanks, buddy. Do you have any funny anecdotes about dealing with the State Department? Seems like SF and the diplomatic service would be a bit of a culture clash.
Well. Yeah, I don't know how funny they are, but when I was dealing on the counterterrorism intelligence collection, in case our embassies were seized by terrorists, the ambassadors and the diplomats thought, okay, this is a good thing to have. I want someone to come and rescue me if things go bad, and so. I dealt with the security people and the ambassador and the chief of station, and they were in high threat areas. So they were supportive of having the military, prepare for this. And, more, I think what your listener is referring to is approaches to foreign policy decisions and use of force, the interagency, where we do have differences of opinion, sometimes. That's where the different departments, can diverge sometimes. But on what I did there, I don't think. And then also generally, I wouldn't say all ambassadors, but lots of ambassadors welcome all the help they can get. So they've got a, whatever size country team, but if you can send them a few people that will really augment them and do something for them useful, they generally welcome it. It's more for their empire and more ability to do good things, in their particular country. So yeah, I didn't really have that experience.
They didn't look at you as atavistic knuckle draggers who should sit in a corner and only come out when break when.
Well, they'd laugh one ambassador. I mentioned John Negroponte earlier that I served with over several decades. When we were both in the Bush II administration, he said, "I remember you as a Special Forces captain, and you wanted to take pictures of my bathroom and all this other stuff." I said, "Well, if you were being held in your bathroom, we're going to want to know how to get in there."
Spencer Devins, thank you very much. From your perspective, what does the United States need to address the PRC going into the rest of this century?
Good question.
When does your recommendation need to be done by?
So I have a chapter in the book called "Winning the New Cold War" that deals with how to prevail over China over several decades, and Russia as an ally of China as well. And probably the biggest factor, since they're a global power in an integrated world, is really the economic and technological competition. We've been the dominant economic power in the world for a century, and we never had a rival in the 20th century that had more than 50% of our GDP. So we had this economic escalation dominance, and World War II is the best example of that. We get surprised at the beginning, but then we mobilize American industry and, we flood the Pacific with ships and, other things and landing craft to go to D-Day and all that. And, that may not be as true in the 21st century if China continues to grow. Now, they've been stumbling. And then you also have this revolution in technology with AI and quantum, and that can remake the world. And we don't want to be on the losing end of that.
Right.
And then those things translate into, like the original Cold War, into competitions for global influence, all around Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. As warfare has evolved, our position has been eroded in the Western Pacific. So China kind of went to school on the U.S. military more than any other country in Desert Storm, or in the aftermath of Desert Storm. And the big conclusion the Chinese drew out of this was terrible idea to give the United States 6 months to build up massive combat power right on your border and then beat your brains in, And so they developed this anti-access strategy to try to prevent U.S. force, hurt the ones that are in the region by attacking air bases and surface ships, and then prevent the reinforcements or make it very costly for them to come in. And they've pursued that strategy for several decades. And now you have these new warfare domains, space and cyber, that are inherently global. And while the Chinese are pretty powerful opposite Taiwan, once you get out of missile range, if we were both projecting power, say to Africa or somewhere, the U.S. would dominate. And we'd like to keep it that way. Mm-hmm. So we have undersea dominance, we have really more in long-range strike. We have better space systems. I'd like to keep it that way, because the way for China to become a global military power is to gain advantages in those areas. And, so there's a number of things you have to do to strengthen regional and global deterrence. But then you got to win this Cold War, which might be from proxies and influence and a lot of the covert action and the special ops stuff that, below direct conflict. Because, another characteristic of the old Cold War and this one is nuclear weapons tends to put a little bit of a brake on conventional war. You can't do World War II the way, you otherwise would. And so that means you got to get at your adversary through more devious ways. And, we've got our work cut out for us for there.
M. Corbin, thank you very much. If possible, any commentary on the lasting impact of the ISI director, General Hamid Gul?
He, it's a funny question. So he came in late in the Soviet-Afghan war and was a conventional armor officer and wanted to shift the insurgency into conventional battle, essentially, and ordered assaults on cities, which played right into Soviet and
doctrine,
communist Afghan government hands. Like, you make yourself a big target and stay there long enough, we'll pound you. You don't want to do daylight assaults on cities generally, but particularly when your enemy has artillery superiority and air superiority and everything else. So he was a pretty disruptive force in the end game of Afghanistan, and then became very anti-US. And so over time, supported the Taliban and others. Over time, really became an agitator for, essentially not partnering with the U.S. and everything else. So he's not my favorite Pakistani general.
Spencer Devins, thank you very much. He has a couple questions coming up. He's in a meeting, so he's going to get to these later. Do you see any sort of scenario where we risk becoming Eisenhower's feared garrison state while we try to maintain escalation dominance with an adversary that could have a larger GDP than we do?
Yeah, so that's the challenge of the economics. Is then I say now China may have peaked, and they're emphasizing political control over economic growth, and so they're kind of killing their golden goose right now. So it may not be as dire as we think, but they could recover. And the genius of Eisenhower was to recognize that the Cold War would be fought hopefully short of conventional war because of nuclear weapons. And in fact, he emphasized nuclear weapons very dramatically in his strategy, the national security strategy, the new look. But he also thought it was very important to put the United States in a long-term competition on a sustainable fiscal path. We had spent a lot of money mobilizing for Korea, demobilized after World War II and then ramped up for Korea. And it really created a lot of budget problems and everything. And so Eisenhower kind of put us on a steady state where innovation was emphasized. Nuclear weapons would be used to deter war and hopefully bring an end if you had one. But also all these innovations in, after Sputnik and the space race, NASA and DARPA was created, and then the NRO, and so, it was and then used covert action, to compete in the third world. And so it was a pretty effective grand strategy, and then even on the economic side, the interstate highway system, and so it's a good model for, at the end of the day, I think who wins this new Cold War between us and China and its allies will be who has the strongest overall system, which means our domestic power base, which it's got to be resilient. You can't spend yourself into oblivion. And, and one of the dangers of great powers is they, both we and the Soviets made these mistakes in the Cold War, is strategy is an art, not a science. So you can overreach and make yourself vulnerable on peripheral things, or you can underreach and not do anything, and then the world really gets bad for you. And we've done both over various periods of time. And you want to find that realm where you're adding to your power, not depleting it, and then taking advantage of your adversary when they make a mistake. And that's what we eventually did in the late Cold War. I like to describe the Cold War. We started off pretty strong, the first decade and a half. We kind of had trouble in the middle couple decades, and then we finished strong, and that was enough to win it.
Great answer. Also from Sensor, if it's possible, how would you seek to make covert action programs immune to the pulls of U.S. domestic political theater?
I'm not sure it works like that.
Yeah, so, intelligence emphasizes our Republican form of government, where a couple committees in Congress do the oversight for the American people to keep things secret. But, one of the tests of a covert action program is, it ought to be consistent with broader U.S. foreign policy interests and goals. And when it's too disjointed from that, and then the likelihood that it's going to get leaked by opponents goes up as well, you're going to have trouble, you're going to have controversy. And so, the test of it is you'd like the American people to say, okay, yeah, I see why my government's doing that. It's in our interest. And I see why it was secret, rather than what the hell are you doing?
Right.
And so we've had both over decades, and hopefully we've learned how to do that. The answer is not to do covert action. I mean, presidents will differ on how aggressive they want to be, but when it succeeds, it really succeeds very well, and it's generally our biggest programs that are the most successful. But then we've also had spectacular failures like Bay of Pigs and others. You just got to avoid the dumb shit and do the smart shit. But.
Right. And unfortunately, sometimes you don't know if it's dumb shit or smart shit until it's already done.
Yeah, right.
I mean, sometimes.
That's right.
How involved or aware should the average American be about national security topics, and how would you amend current engagement?
Well, I think we're very affected by what goes on in the rest of the world, and it's incumbent upon our political leaders, to make that case. And then, and I think engagement is important. And one of the reasons we're connected is not just trade and others, although that matters. It's also the reach of weapons, and the destructiveness of weapons. So beginning with nuclear weapons, but also now there's more ways to reach intercontinental distances, cyber being one example, so the two oceans don't protect us in the way they have in the past. And, what happens overseas matters to us. And it's the same thing, as terrorists go from a local or regional problem to ones with global ambitions or extra regional, it affects our interests more. And so, generally, when we've disengaged, we've paid a price for it down the road. Now, that doesn't mean over-engagement. It just means you can't completely disengage. You use economy of force in a lot of places, and that's enough, but you can't just up and leave and say, I don't care about the place.
You've mentioned cyber a couple times, and I'm curious about your position on this. And obviously, sometimes the cyber gangs are in China or in Russia. They're in a non-permissive environment. But, we do see like ransomware attacks on hospitals where a hospital will get locked down. If a group of armed people were to go into that hospital and lock it down, we have specific reactions to it. Do you feel as though the U.S. government should start viewing certain types of cyber attacks as actually offensive military or
acts of war,
or acts of terrorism, and treat them as such?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one, cyber is this unique weapon that it can be used by states. It can be used, to harass and destroy, distributed denial of service attacks, and then really destructive attacks. It can be used for intelligence collection as well as force, et cetera. So it has a lot of different attributes. And so where a lot of supposedly non-governmental cyber actors are operating in a hostile territory and hurting you, you have to have some kind of diplomatic or some response, because they're operating on this guy's territory, probably with his acceptance, and they're hurting you. And so it's mainly a problem right now in Russia, but it's also China as well. And then, as you mentioned, we had this experience, when I was Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. North Korea whacked Sony Pictures, and the Iranians whacked Saudi Arabian oil, Abcake and others. Oh, big destructive attacks. And as you said, had North Koreans walked into Sony and blew up those computers, there'd be no doubt about a response. But, when you do it with cyber, it's this, well, what is it? And, it's just a computer, or 30,000 computers, or whatever the case is. But so we have a ways to go in this nascent field to develop. In a way, it was easier to develop strategy in the nuclear world after the advent of nuclear weapons than it has been. Cyber's been around now for a couple decades, and we're still struggling with what does it mean and how does it fit in the world of force, and what's acceptable intelligence collection and what's not. So like this intellectual on a massive scale, this intellectual property theft. Like one of the things I thought in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, where we really didn't interact economically and we restricted technologies. They got some of them, but I thought, you really can't steal your way to economic competitiveness. So they're trying to get our computers through, clandestine means and stuff like that. and it seemed like we had enormous advantage. Cyber and the Chinese have changed my views about that,
Right.
given massive gains they've made economically from taking intellectual property. It looks like crime pays, you know?
Right.
So
Right. And it's also tough because we've had people on the show in the counterintelligence industry or from, the FBI, the CIA, who are like, when every, Chinese national or Chinese descendant who has relatives in mainland are a potential spy for the United States, like how do you stop your technology from walking out the doors when the Chinese government can walk up to them and go, hey, I saw your grandmother last week.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. So I mean, the FBI's job jar has grown dramatically with this technology problem and the proliferation, the traditional counterintelligence problem of I've got, 100 hostile intelligence officers working in this country has changed pretty dramatically. And then you've got, still international terrorist extremists and domestic. So they got their hands full.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll do one more before we let Mike.
We have like 3 more, if that's okay. Because one of them is a very generous donation. I want to make sure we get to it. I read in your bio that in 1978 you went to over to Hereford, UK, and completed a British SAS UKB course. How did you get that opportunity, and how was that experience for you?
It's also in the book, by all means available, which I hope you guys will go and take a look at.
Yeah. So we were just starting to develop precision counterterrorism capabilities in the late 1970s, after the Munich massacre in 72 and some airline hijackers or hijackings. And, so the Israelis were ahead of us and the Brits were ahead of us in certain ways. And then we started building this capability. And I was fortunate enough, I was in a special forces unit in Germany at the time, and Bad Tolz part of the 10th group. And I got selected to go to this training early on. And, it not only gave me some new tactical skills, this close quarter battle, and they had a lot to teach us then. Today, we're the best force in the world in those areas, but and have been for the past couple of decades. But it started me really on this counterterrorism track that became a pretty big part of my career, along with unconventional warfare and other parts that so it was more than just tactical training in a sense. It got me thinking about precision counterterrorism operations and all that goes into it and stuff. So it's a great experience.
So we have 4 questions left. I'm only going to ask one of them, and then we'll get the other 3 next show, just because we don't want to keep you too late. We know you're on a timeline. Mohammed Sabani, thank you very much for the very generous donation. Love the show as always, y'all. What actions, if any, can be taken for America to compete in hardware chip production with the entire rare earth processing and supply chain being owned by Chinese? Also, how can America protect its infrastructure from cyber attacks?
Yeah, 2 great questions, really at the heart of this new competition. So one, we've got this CHIPS Act to try to repatriate production that had gone overseas the past couple of decades. In advanced chips, we really are still ahead, but then you want to restrict some of that. So I think, and that's companies like NVIDIA, the GPUs and stuff. That's been subject of some administration restrictions and things. I want to maintain that lead. There are certain areas where we're behind in, precision, how many things you can fit on a chip and stuff, the scale, nanometers and things. That Taiwan Semiconductor, is more advanced than us, but it's just a critical area. It's an area that we invented, we dominated. It had military implications as well as commercial and economic, and it's going to be just as important in this century. And then the caller, 2 other parts to that. One, the de-risking of supply chains. Now, I think we're discovering more rare earths everywhere. China has pretty big dominance now, but, they're all over the world, and including in the United States, Wyoming and elsewhere. And so we just got to have the right policies to go after them, and then the relationships with some foreign governments to compete in that area. And then, where we're dependent in pharmaceuticals, as we saw in in COVID and medical supplies, you got to de-risk that. Doesn't mean decouple completely, but you have to have alternative sources of supply and assured sources of supply. Doesn't mean everything has to be in the United States, just can't all be in China.
Right.
And then on cybersecurity, that's a tough one because the public-private partnership only goes so far because, we've got a free market system and it's sensitive. Companies don't want to tell you all their vulnerabilities or, for lots of reasons. And so, our cyber commander has 3 missions, essentially: to support combatant commanders, to defend all of DoD's networks, but then to defend the United States against a massive attack, something that's beyond crime and everything else. But he's the only commander who really can't see the battlefield. He sees part of the battlefield, or if he can target the attacker, where it's coming from, he can see that. But if he doesn't see the point of origin and it's hitting all these other places that he doesn't have visibility on, you got a challenge with that. And so, there's a big debate about cyber offense and cyber defense. I think some of the advances in AI are going to really enable the offense going forward. We need a lot of attention to this, and if quantum computing comes around in the next decade or so, add to it. So it's great. Those are both really strategic questions, and it's not something national security councils typically are trained or to kind of problem.
Well, Mike, I really appreciate you being willing to tackle so many of these difficult subjects, and this turned out to be a pretty wide-ranging interview, actually. I hope that all of you out there will go and check out his memoir, by all means available. I read it. It was terrific. And we will have Mike back next Friday for part 2, where I'm sure we'll have more of these policy discussions. And we'll also be talking about the latter part of his career, where he served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Ops and Low Intensity Conflict, ASD SO, and also headed up USDI. So again, Mikey, thank you very much for taking the time for this interview.
Yeah, thank you both.
And we will see all of you next Friday.
Also, real quick, make sure you check out Jack and I being interviewed on the Cleared Hot podcast with Andy Stump. He was generous enough to invite us out to Montana, and
it's out there now.
Sat around and shot the shit for a while. So, and Mike, thanks so much. We will see you on Friday.
Okay, take care.
Thanks.